Right, okay, thank you for everybody who have just told me that there is no sound. The sound had muted itself. It's now hopefully unmuted. Just run through again very quickly what I've just been talking about then. It is show 329. It's the 30th of April. We have quite a packed show for you. Hopefully my voice will hold out. I'm still suffering the after effects of the strep throat that I've been suffering from. If you can just tell me that you can actually hear me, that would help enormously. Yes, on now, says Christine. Thank you very much. Right, so bike parking charges in Hackney are given the go-ahead. Rider killed avoiding a deer. We'll be looking at a blood biker who was involved in a fatal collision when he shouldn't have been using flashing blue lights and a siren. We'll be looking at the problem of smart motorway refuges, which turn out to be shorter than the recommended, and a graffiti artist who drew round a pothole. The council aren't fixing the pothole yet, but they will fine him if he carries on painting them. Another pair of first ever airbag trousers have been announced, and we'll have a quick look at the Bajaj-Triumph baby bike, which is now set for a London launch probably in June. And the FIM are launching a Women's Motorcycling World Championship. More on that. Plus Eurosport and BTSport, who both of course cover different aspects of motorcycle racing, are merging. I doubt that will be to the benefit of viewers, but anyway, hey ho. And finally, today's discussion point, we'll have a look at the emergency vehicle regulations and the issue of noble cause as I come back to that blood biker collision. All right, okay, so that's what's on today. And as I said there, if you do miss a show, do pop over to my YouTube channel, and that's where you can find these shows. So who have we got looking in this morning? We have Christine, we have Richard, we have Duncan, we have Sue, and yes, okay, and yeah, so thanks for everybody there to give me the heads up on the sound. Let's just turn that off again. Right, on with the first story then. Well, the first thing I just want to actually say is that Science of Being Seen is going out on Wednesday the 3rd. For some reason I put Wednesday the 1st of May. It isn't, it's Wednesday the 3rd. And if you haven't seen it yet, do pop along. I was lucky enough to be able to go and talk to the guys from BikeSafe, Metropolitan Police BikeSafe team on Tuesday in the morning, and my voice did hold out for the hour plus I was down there with them. But if you want to come along and see the same presentation, then that is going out on Wednesday. So do pop along if you possibly can. Don't forget, it is available on catch up for at least 72 hours after the event. Right, so on with the first story. Well, the group campaigning against the new emissions-based motorcycle parking charges for motorcycles in Hackney have branded the decision not to rethink the policy, which includes electric motorcycles, a farce. The policy was also challenged on the grounds that it used outdated emissions data from old ICE engines, not the ones which are now current. Now, Hackney believes the new charges could reduce the number of motorcyclists parking for short periods of time by up to 70%, and all-day parking will only be allowed in solo motorbike parking bays in selected high-demand zones. Now, although the initial charge proposals have been slashed, it will still cost a rider who wants to park 10 hours a day in the same bay for a year around £2,300, which is a huge amount, frankly. Now, the new charges went before the council's scrutiny panel, but despite electric motorcycles clearly not contributing to vehicle emissions, they decided against recommending a rethink. Now, Greens councillor and frankly, I was a bit surprised that this was the Greens councillor, Alastair Binney-Lubbock, said that whilst he supports moves to cut polluting emissions from traffic, quote, this disproportionate targeting and projected reduction of a lower emission form of transport is contrary to the council's climate and air quality goals. These plans would seem to make Hackney a very hostile place for powered two-wheelers and motorcycles. Now, his objections were supported, not so surprisingly, by the Conservative opposition leader, Michael Levy, and his deputy Simchi Steinberger. Councillor Steinberger wanted to know if the council had considered the impact on people's livelihoods. The councillor responsible for Hackney's transport policy, who's Meta Cohen, he defended the decision, saying that the council had changed the parking policy in 3 very significant ways: removing the original short stay policy, so bikes can now park all day, cutting the original proposed charges by 80% for ICE bikes and 90% for e-bikes, although why charge for e-bikes if this is an emissions policy, and phasing in the new charges over the next 3 years. And Councillor Coburn also stressed that not to have a charge is not an option. The council's deputy head of parking, Michael Ben, said that there are already exemptions by law of people loading and unloading goods. So he said, quote, "If you are delivering a takeaway, you're covered, and that the charges do not aim to have consequences for gig economy workers." However, that's not obvious how that'll going to be affecting those courier riders who are actually sitting waiting for an order to be collected. Presumably they will still have to pay the parking charges because they're not actually delivering, are they? Now, Save London Motorcycling criticised the scrutiny panel's decision. They called it a rubber stamp and said, "We urge all riders to join our campaign and stand up against this injustice." And as I've said before, this is where I believe the organisations like the National Motorcycle Council and the MCIA ought to be getting involved. Frankly, this is not just a Hackney issue, it's not just a London issue, it is a national issue, because what happens in London usually spreads out and about. Right, second story then. A motorcyclist who after a collision with a car had sadly swerved to avoid a deer that ran into the road. Now this incident happened in Alvechurch in Worcestershire last Thursday, just after 8 in the morning. Now the police believe the deer caused both a black SUV and the Honda involved to swerve, and they collided with one another. The 31-year-old man was pronounced dead at the scene. The driver wasn't injured. Deer are increasingly an issue across the UK. They cause a lot of crashes, and surprisingly the area where most crashes happen is around South London. I was very surprised to discover that, but there are apparently really big deer populations in the wooded areas around the fringe of London and the sort of M25 area. But frankly, any wooded area is a problem, and of course they are animals that are active most early morning and late evening, so those are always times to be on your guard. The rutting season is October, November, if I remember right, so that's when they're most likely to be on the road, but we do have to be alert for them at all times. So a sad story there. And another sad story, a statement by the former Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has finally been made public as a response to a prevention of future deaths report by a coroner. Now, I'll come back to this story at the end of the show and go into a little bit more depth, but what happened was a blood biker who was on a run, he collided with a car after he went through a red light on the A6. Now it turns out he was using blue lights and a siren, and this collision happened in an evening in May 2018 at about 7:45. Now he was transporting the blood products between hospitals on a red and yellow liveried BMW R1200, which is run by the Northwest Blood Bikes organisation. Now sadly he was airlifted to hospital where he later died. The Jaguar driver, a 65-year-old man, he suffered minor injuries and was also taken to hospital. Now Mr. Kerwin from Kendal, he had been a volunteer for Northwest Blood Bikers since 2016. Now, since that crash, 3 new blood bikes have been named in his honour. The Royal Lancaster Infirmary has a Russell Kerwin Blood and Science Lab, and the city also hosts the Russell Kerwin Memorial Games. So, you know, he has been tributed by the area significantly, and the convoy of around 500 motorcyclists actually joined his funeral cortege at Kendal Parish Church. Now the inquest concluded the Jaguar was travelling at 34 miles an hour at the time of the collision, but had recently braked. They did say that had the vehicle been going slower. The driver might have had more time to adjust to the bike. Now, the report itself was dated April 2020, but I only saw the report and Grant Shapps' response around 10 days ago. Now, quite why it's taken so long for the statement to be made public, but isn't clear. But whilst extending his deepest sympathies to the family, friends and colleagues of Russell Kirwan for his tragic loss, Mr. Sharps concluded that on the information provided, the incident would appear to be one where existing laws were contravened rather than where the existing regulations are inadequate. The fitment and use of blue lights and sirens and the contravention of the red traffic light all appear to be unlawful on the information provided, neither part of providing a response to an emergency at the request of an NHS ambulance service nor enabled by other legislation. Established governance and oversight procedures were therefore circumvented or non-existent. And I'll come back to this story at the end of the show as I talk about the legislation, but also talk about the noble cause issue that causes people to take unjustified risks. All right, okay, so on to a section I recorded earlier today. This is a bunch of news stories for you. And in other news, with the Smart Motorway programme cancelled over safety fears, there's now increasing pressure to reverse the conversion of the hard shoulder to running lanes and to reinstate the hard shoulders. One of the key claims for the safety of all lane running was the use of emergency refuge bays, but it's now well known that the distances between these refuges is often several times the distance between the refuges on the original pilot scheme. And experts have said that this means they're frequently too far apart to allow for vehicles to come to a halt in relative safety. And I've just discovered that ITV News Meridian carried out an investigation into the size of the refuges on smart motorways in the Thames Valley, south and the southeast, which indicate that many have been built to a shorter length than the original standard. They apparently carried this out after complaints from drivers who found bays already blocked by breakdowns and recovery vehicles. So here are their findings. On the M23, just 2 of 12 bays were measured at the 100-metre standard or above. One was recorded at 80 metres. On the M20 in Kent, they measured every bay at under 100 metres, the shortest being 90.97 metres and the longest 94.58 metres. On the M25, between junctions 5 and 7, just 2 out of 14 refuges are at the 100-metre standard or longer. The minimum was 89.78 metres. On the M4, they measured 13 bays and 6 were below the 100-metre standard, with the shortest at 94.92. On the M3, 8 out of 12 were over 100 metres, but the shortest was 95.29. When asked to comment, National Highways, who are responsible for smart motorways, they acknowledged that some refuges may vary in design because of geographical features, but also said they cannot verify the measurements taken by Meridian and went on to dispute some of them, saying that the bays on the M23 and M20 do meet the design standard. It really would be nice to get some straight talking out of National Highways. It's beyond belief they don't have their own measurements for the bays. Meanwhile, in Stoke-on-Trent, the City Council has issued a warning after a graffiti artist painted around a pothole, writing "Joke on Trent." The artist sprayed on the pothole outside Lytton Street in Stoke. The council's pledged to fix the pothole within the next 90 days. The council spokesman said, "We are aware of the pothole on Lytton Street. The defect is non-urgent. Anyone caught defacing the highway commits a criminal act and may be prosecuted." I would wish they put as much effort into actually filling the hole in. Almost 2 years ago to the day, in show 138, I featured the airbag over trousers being developed by Brocchiard de Milleray, a former jet fighter pilot whose leg was fractured in 17 places after his bike was rolled into by a car where the handbrake wasn't secured. As he lay in traction, he remembered the pressure suit trousers from his flying days, and he came up with the idea for his CX Aerodynamics airbag over trousers. As they went on sale, they were billed as the world's first airbag pants for riders. All right, now the website's down, so I don't know whether they're still on sale. And that could account for a Swedish company's claim that they too have developed the world's first pair of airbag jeans. The motorcycle jeans use Armalith, which is a single layer abrasion resistant fabric, which is also used to limit the inflation of the trousers. The Swedish company believes the airbag absorbs 10 times the impact energy compared with traditional impact armour, though I have yet to see test results. Like the early airbag jackets, the jeans are fired by a tether line connecting the pants to the bike, causing a replaceable CO2 cartridge to fire that inflates the airbag in milliseconds. The problem is, whilst adequate if the rider simply falls off, in a collision with a vehicle, the tether is likely to be too slow. And finally, something I missed back in February is the merger of Eurosport and BTSport, and their rebranding as TNT Sport after the latter was purchased by Warner Brothers Discovery. Both channels have delivered live and recorded coverage of motorcycle racing for years. Eurosport currently broadcasts live coverage of the Bennett's British Superbike Championship, the World Superbike Championship and the Endurance World Championship. BT Sport have been the exclusive UK and Ireland MotoGP broadcaster since 2013. Since Eurosport has rights to the 2024 Paris Olympics, it's likely the final merger under the new name will happen after that event. With the merger having cleared the regulators, pricing and packaging options are yet to be revealed, but motorcycle racing fans hoping for a reduction in costs will almost certainly be disappointed. Right, okay, so come and giving my voice a bit of a break today, back live. So the next story, coming back to motorcycles, is that Rajiv Bajaj has announced that the new baby Bajaj-Triumph bike that's been spotted testing here in the UK and also out in India will be globally unveiled in London by Triumph by the end of June, perhaps on June the 27th. And he also confirmed the bike will be going on sale around the second quarter of this financial year, which basically means it's going to be on sale pretty immediately after the unveiling, because there's only about 3 days of that second quarter left. Anyway, he hinted there's more than one bike under development, and we've certainly seen a street scrambler version of the Bajaj Triumph that's been spotted testing in India multiple times over the last few months, and there's also certainly a retro roadster which takes inspiration from the existing Triumph Bonneville range of motorcycles. We've seen that here in the UK on the streets, and the bike is expected to be powered by a liquid-cooled single-cylinder engine of between 300 and 400 cc. No triples, I'm afraid, down at the baby Triumph end of the market. Little comment there from Kevin. He says he has a deer whistle on his bike. I've never known how actually useful they are. It's something I would like to see some research on actually, but yeah, lots of people anecdotally say they are a good thing. Whether they do work or not, I really don't know. Anyway, another story, motorsport, about the FIM and Dorna this time. Dorna organised the championships for the FIM, and they have between them have confirmed that 2024 will see the launch of a new Women's Motorcycle World Championship, and this is said to be to broaden women's access to motorcycle racing and to create a platform for female riders. The aim is to give them a professional championship where women can race and earn money as they do so as professional riders. Now, it will be a single make class. The bike supplier is to be announced in due course. The plan is to have at least 6 rounds of 2 races each in Europe, running, quote, mainly within the framework of the SBK World Championships, the superbike races in other words, with the first round in March or April next year. Now, that mainly expression does lead me to wonder if the championship could become a support round for the 24-hour World Endurance Championship races, which are held at Le Mans, Spa and the Paul Ricard circuit in the south of France. And that would actually make a lot of sense, because then some of the women could actually form teams and race in 24-hour rounds too. So that would be quite an interesting And Kevin says, "Dear Whistle mixed reviews." Yeah, that's about the way I would see it. There are videos of them working, but you never quite know whether it's the whistle or there's just the sound of the motorcycle, the sight of the motorcycle approaching. Anyway, on to the final in-depth point today. Keeping things a little bit short because of my voice, as you can probably hear, it's a bit raspy. So back to that statement from the former Transport Secretary about the legality of using blues and twos on blood bikes. Now, I'm speaking here as a former blood biker myself. I worked in the Kent area for SERV, Service by Emergency Rider Volunteers, for a number of years in the mid-1990s. So I do have a bit of a personal perspective on this story, not least discovering that after rushing blood to a hospital for one emergency, the patient had actually died on the operating table waiting for my blood. So let's go back to the incident I talked about at the top of the show, where Russell Kerwin, a volunteer blood biker, was killed in a collision with a car after he passed through a red light whilst using blue lights and a siren on his red and yellow liveried blood bike back in May 2018. Now, Mr. Kerwin was volunteering for Northwest Blood Bikers, and they say they aim to provide a totally free but professional voluntary service out of normal working hours for the transport of urgent and emergency items throughout the night and 24 hours a day at weekends and on bank holidays. Now, Northwest Blood Bikers, they've been operating since May 2012. After the inquest, the coroner James Newman wrote to the Transport Secretary, then Grant Shapps, part of a prevention of, as part of a prevention of future deaths report, asking for clarification as to, quote, what constitutes an emergency and whether current legislation allows blood couriers like this exemption from traffic laws and whether it needs modification. So, Mr. Shapps said that Mr. Kerwin had made, quote, an incorrect interpretation of the regulations in assuming he could use emergency lights and sirens, and the former Transport Secretary added that the fitting of blue lights and the siren, as well as the running of the red light by Mr. Kerwin, had all been unlawful. He also pointed to a previous application for exemption to be able to use these emergency lights and sirens by the National Association of Blood Bikes had actually been rejected, and that there were no plans for that to change. And he concluded that the incident involving Mr. Kerwin seemed to him to be one in which existing laws were contravened rather than being a situation where existing regulations were unclear or inadequate. So the coroner, who was James Newman, he also noted that the samples being transported by Mr. Kerwin were actually routine in nature, and they were being transported in the nature of a contract for courier services. And the reason for writing his report was that he feared, unless the situation was clarified and unless action was taken, that future similar deaths could be taken. So let's have a quick look at the blood bike in question. That is it. As I say, the thing I'm always slightly concerned about with bikes like this is that the motorcycle, first of all, is provided by the Northwest Blood Bikers. And I would also point out that you can see quite clearly it has blue lights and a siren fitted to that motorcycle. Obviously, they were capable of being activated. Now, going back to my own days as a blood biker, when we had to use our own machines and pay for our own petrol, incidentally, the rules were absolutely clear to us when we took on the role. We weren't emergency vehicles. We had no dispensation to exceed speed limits, certainly none to run red lights, and that under no circumstances could we use blue lights or even dress up looking like a policeman. The most we were actually allowed was to use a yellow bib with a reflective blue panel saying blood on the back. So quite why the Northwest Blood Bikers have actually fitted the lights and sirens to the bike, I really do have no idea. Now, I know that there are accusations out there that blood bikers want to play emergency bike rider, and frankly, I think it's a mistake to fit these to the bike, even if the riders know that they are not supposed to use them. There would be a temptation to press the relevant buttons and turn them on. So, do blood bikers really want to play emergency bike rider? Well, I suspect that may be true of a few riders who sign up for the job, but most simply want to put something back in to the community, and they see using a motorcycle and using their skills as a rider as a way to do that. That's certainly why I signed up. But let me offer you a slightly different perspective on that, because this brings us to what's known as the noble cause bias. Now, cognitive biases is something I've talked about on my posts on Facebook and also over on my coffee page, of course. They are systematic patterns where we deviate from the norm, or we deviate from rational judgments. Now, it's well known in the emergency services that when responding to a call to save life and limb, the drivers are vulnerable to a special kind of red mist. Their focus becomes on getting to the scene as rapidly as possible, thinking that that's the best way to save the person who's at risk, rather than driving on safely themselves to ensure that they actually do get to the scene of the emergency. Now, the same issue in a sort of slightly different way actually affects riders and drivers who hear or see an approaching emergency vehicle. They'll often do daft things. You've probably seen people sort of stopping on blind corners or on crests of hills in the hope that they're helping the emergency driver. So it's this urge to sort of do our best in an emergency situation that causes these irrational responses, both as the drivers of the emergency vehicles themselves, but also the ordinary road users around us who are thinking they are helping the emergency driver. Now, I very much doubt that blood bikers are immune from the noble cause issue. And as I said, I was myself a blood biker back in the 1990s, and so I do have my own perspective on this. Now, whilst many of the deliveries that I made as a blood biker were relatively routine, they were rush jobs, but there was no specific urgency. But there was one that was very different. It was a middle of the night run. I think I was out at something like 2 a.m. in the morning, and I was called out, and I was actually told on the phone that the blood was needed very, very urgently indeed for a woman who was hemorrhaging, giving birth. And she was not only a rare blood group, but she needed pints of blood. So they'd had to basically send to the national, I think it's the blood supply place. It's in Tooting, St George's Hospital. That's where it used to be anyway. So I took off on my bike from Kent. I rode out to Brands Hatch. I met the courier there who had picked the blood up from South London, brought it to Brands Hatch, and then I carried it on to Margate. Now, I knew it was extremely urgent. I'd been told to. So I did my best to get it there as rapidly as possible. I did break some speed limits. I did run some red lights very carefully because it was middle of the night, and I knew I wasn't following the rules I was supposed to be following, but I knew it was a genuine emergency. Sadly, the woman actually died on the operating table before I made it, and I've never forgotten that. That was a noble cause, and I broke the rules to do my best to get that blood to that woman. Now, as far as I can tell, there was no judgment in the coroner's report as to why Mr. Kerwin chose to pass through the red light, which resulted in the collision, but I'd be surprised if noble cause didn't play at least some part. Running red lights is rarely a part of a rational riding strategy. So we'll never know what made Mr. Kerwin make his decision. The tragedy is that in this case, the delivery was actually entirely routine. There was no emergency element to it at all. So as the coroner said, and I agree, blood bikers do fantastic work. But personally, I really think we have to ask two things. Why the organisation fitted the lights and the siren and gave the rider the temptation to use them. But whether or not blood bikers, the organisations, really make the riders involved in blood biking understand the psychological factors involved in doing something in a noble cause, and whether they are really factored into the preparation of blood bikers before they are allowed to volunteer. So yeah, interesting question there. Kevin says, driven on blues and twos for decades, never had a near miss running a red. I treated as give way. Yeah, I mean that's basically what you would have to do, isn't it? Um, so something went wrong somewhere there. Riders riding blood bikes aren't trained on emergency response. Yes, they will have some advanced riding qualifications, but I fully accept that, what I learned doing advanced riding and what I teach to advanced riders now is miles away from emergency response driving. So, yeah, a very sad story to finish the show today. So that is it. As always, I'm interested in comments and feedback on the show. Hopefully, voice will be a little bit less scratchy by Wednesday, when I will be back with the next show. So if you are out there today on your bikes, do stay shiny side up and enjoy the weather. It's looking a little bit brighter than it was when I started the show. Sue has, yeah, just thanks, Sue. Very interesting, she says. Right, so yeah, that's it from me today. Hopefully, as I say, if you are out there on the bike today, do stay shiny side up. Thanks once again for looking in today.